Before the first American soldier set foot on European soil, a war was already raging, not in the skies above Berlin or the trenches of France, but in the factories of Detroit. While Europe burned, America was still half asleep. The Great Depression had left cities bruised, and the heart of industry, Detroit, was struggling to find its pulse. Then came the war. Hitler had conquered Europe with tanks that roared across nations and aircraft that darkened the skies. His Reich depended on speed, steel, and machinery, all things Detroit understood better than anyone. When President Roosevelt called for the arsenal of democracy, the words found their home in Detroit's beating heart. Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, companies built to feed consumer dreams, were suddenly told to feed the front lines. And they did not hesitate. Overnight, automobile assembly lines were converted into war machines. Factories that once rolled out cars now birthed bombers, tanks, and engines of destruction. This wasn't just production, it was transformation. Every bolt turned in Detroit echoed across the Atlantic. Every engine assembled meant one less victory for Hitler. But this wasn't simple patriotism. It was a cold, calculated decision. The U.S. understood something the Nazis never could. Wars are not won by emotion or ideology, they are won by production capacity. Steel, oil, and engines, that was America's battlefield. And so, Detroit became the forge of the modern world. At the peak of its output, a bomber rolled off its assembly line every hour. Tanks were built faster than Hitler could replace his losses. Engines poured out by the thousands, shipped across oceans to feed the Allied advance. Hitler's empire, vast and vicious, depended on conquest for resources. Detroit depended on rhythm. Its rhythm was relentless. For every tank Germany built, Detroit built 5. For every plane that took off from a Nazi airfield, another 10 were born in American factories. The balance of power was shifting, not in the skies or seas, but in the roar of Detroit's machines. Hitler believed ideology fueled war. America proved that industry does. The world hadn't seen this kind of power before, a city turned into a weapon. Detroit didn't just build machines. It built destiny. This was not a war fought by soldiers alone. It was fought by men and women on the assembly line, engineers, welders, machinists. Their battlefield was the factory floor, their weapon was the wrench, their victory, measured in production numbers. Hitler's war machine would eventually collapse not just from bombs or battles, but from exhaustion, drained by an enemy that could outbuild him 1,000 times over. Detroit was that enemy. The city that turned horsepower into firepower. The city that outproduced Hitler's entire empire. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt delivered his now famous radio address on December 29, 1940, his words struck like thunder through a sleeping giant. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. That phrase ignited something deep within America's industrial heartland, and nowhere more powerfully than in Detroit. At that moment, Hitler's army stood seemingly unstoppable. France had fallen. Britain was gasping for breath beneath nightly bombardments. The swastika flew over Europe like a shadow-devouring light. Roosevelt knew that if America did not act, the world would collapse into tyranny. But America's strength did not lie on the battlefield. Not yet. Its real weapon was potential, the vast machinery of capitalism itself. Detroit, the Motor City, had mastered one thing better than any other place on Earth: mass production. The same assembly lines that churned out cars for the open roads could be repurposed to build machines for war. And so began the greatest industrial mobilization in human history. Factories that once hummed with the rhythm of civilian life now thundered with urgency. The auto industry turned into an army. Ford built the world's largest assembly line at Willow Run, an industrial cathedral of steel and sweat, where thousands of men and women labored day and night. It wasn't just a plant, it was a statement of power. Within months, Detroit was unrecognizable. Civilian car production was banned. Every ounce of energy, every drop of oil, every mind was redirected toward one mission: defeat Hitler's war machine. Henry Ford, once an isolationist, now oversaw the creation of the B-24 Liberator bomber. A flying fortress of American engineering. What once took months to build was now rolling off the line in mere hours. The speed was unimaginable. The efficiency, terrifying. By 1942, Detroit was producing tanks, bombers, trucks, machine guns, and engines at a rate that stunned even the most optimistic planners. The factories didn't sleep. Men rotated shifts with women, whose entry into the workforce marked the birth of a new era. They became the Rosies, strong, determined, and unbreakable. Hitler's empire had no equivalent. Germany relied on fragmented production, limited raw materials, and a labor force stretched thin by war. America had abundance: iron, oil, manpower, and above all, organization. Detroit wasn't just a city of factories, it was a living organism. Its veins pumped oil instead of blood. Its heartbeat was the rhythmic hammering of steel. Every gear, every piston, every machine served a single purpose: to drown Nazi Germany in sheer output. Military strategists would later say that Hitler underestimated America's capacity to produce. He thought the Americans were soft, indulgent consumers who lacked discipline. But what he didn't understand was that consumption itself had been America's training ground. The same systems that sold millions of cars and radios were now weaponized for mass mobilization. Detroit had perfected the art of scale, and scale wins wars. Roosevelt's call had not fallen on deaf ears. It had awakened a monster. An economic force so vast it could outproduce entire empires. By the end of 1943, Detroit was building more war material than all of Axis Europe combined. Each tank, each bomber, each bullet rolling out of Michigan carried a message. You can't bomb an idea. You can't kill a system. And this system will bury you. In less than a year, Detroit had transformed from a city of automobiles into the most formidable weapons manufacturer the world had ever seen. This was the beginning of Hitler's nightmare, a nation that could outbuild his empire before it even entered the battlefield. War had never seen anything like this. In Nazi Germany, military production was a state command, directed from Berlin, powered by forced labor, and constantly starved by Allied bombings. In America, it was something else entirely: capitalism weaponized. When Detroit entered the war, it wasn't through fear or orders, it was through transformation. The industrial titans who once competed for car buyers now joined forces to compete against time itself. Ford, General Motors, Chrysler. The Big Three. They didn't build armies. They became one. Henry Ford, the aging industrialist who once vowed to keep his company out of war, changed course when he realized the scale of the threat. His engineers began converting car lines into production channels for tanks and bombers. The Willow Run plant, his greatest masterpiece, became the heart of this transformation. Stretching more than a mile long, it was capable of producing a complete B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Think about that, a fully armed, four-engine bomber, rolling out faster than Germany could replace one lost in battle. Ford didn't do this alone. Across town, General Motors transformed its facilities into a labyrinth of war power. Cadillac built tank engines. Buick produced aircraft components. Chevrolet built trucks that carried armies across continents. GM didn't just build machines, it built mobility, the veins of the Allied advance. Chrysler, too, joined the crusade. It built the M3 and M4 Sherman tanks, which would soon dominate the battlefields of North Africa and Europe. The Chrysler tank arsenal in Warren, Michigan, became a symbol of American might. Within months, its workers were producing tanks faster than Hitler's engineers could even test prototypes. In Berlin, Nazi leaders laughed at first. They thought America's consumer culture was weak, soft, distracted, obsessed with pleasure. But they misunderstood something fundamental: Detroit's obsession with efficiency was its weapon. The same assembly line principles that made cars affordable to millions could now make tanks available by the tens of thousands. Each of these companies became its own branch of the military-industrial complex before the term even existed. They weren't just manufacturers, they were strategists. Engineers designed machines for mass replication, not luxury. Every part had to be replaceable, interchangeable, standardized. In Hitler's Germany, production relied on craftsmanship, precise but slow. In Detroit, production relied on system. Ruthless efficiency. Repeatable perfection. And that difference changed the war. While the Luftwaffe scrambled to rebuild after every Allied raid, American factories kept running at full speed, untouched by bombs, fueled by endless resources, and motivated by one unbreakable belief, that freedom could outbuild tyranny. The numbers told the story. Between 1941 and 1945, American factories produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, 100,000 tanks, and 2.4 million trucks. A staggering percentage of that output came from Detroit alone. By 1944, the combined production of Ford, GM, and Chrysler was greater than the entire Axis output combined. This was not just industrial strength. It was industrial dominance. And behind every machine, there were people, tens of thousands of them, working around the clock in noise, heat, and oil. Men who had once assembled Buicks now assembled bombers. Women who had never seen a wrench before now welded armor plating. Immigrants, farmers, veterans, mothers, all united by the same cause. Detroit had turned the art of making cars into the science of making victory. Hitler's empire believed in destruction. Detroit believed in production. And in the end, it was production that would prove the stronger weapon. Because no matter how powerful a tank, a bomb, or an ideology may be, it cannot stand against a factory that never sleeps. In the middle of the Michigan countryside, just outside Ypsilanti, rose a monument not of stone or marble, but of steel, sweat, and fire. It was called Willow Run, and it would become the beating heart of America's industrial miracle. At first glance, it was simply a factory, just another Ford plant, another line of machines. But Willow Run was more than that. It was the single largest factory in human history, stretching a mile long, covering 67 acres under one roof. When it opened in 1941, it wasn't just a building, it was a statement of intent. Henry Ford believed that if he could build cars for every family, he could build bombers for every pilot. The challenge: build the B-24 Liberator, one of the most complex bombers ever designed, an aircraft with over 1 million individual parts. The government said it couldn't be mass-produced. Ford said, "Watch me." The project began in chaos. Ford's engineers were car men, not aircraft builders. They had to learn aviation from scratch, how to rivet aluminum, how to assemble wings, how to balance weight. But Ford wasn't intimidated. He didn't see airplanes, he saw systems. And systems could be optimized. So he took the concept of the automobile assembly line and applied it to the skies. Each section of the bomber, fuselage, wings, tail, engines, moved down the line in perfect coordination. Thousands of workers labored 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The line never stopped. Every hour mattered. At first, the results were disappointing. It took weeks to build a single plane. But Ford refused to yield. He restructured the line, retrained the workers, rebuilt the tools. He brought in experts, simplified designs, cut waste. And slowly, impossibly, the system began to work. Then came the miracle. By mid-1943, Willow Run was producing one fully operational B-24 bomber every 63 minutes. Imagine that, every hour, a 4-engine, 25-ton steel beast rolled out of the hangar, ready to fly, ready to kill. No other factory on Earth had ever achieved such speed. Not even Germany, with all its militarized industry, could match it. Willow Run became a symbol of what America could do when it united under purpose. It wasn't just a factory, it was a declaration of supremacy. Inside its walls, something else was happening too. America's social order was changing. For the first time, thousands of women and African American workers filled the assembly lines. They wore uniforms, held tools, and contributed directly to the war effort. The war blurred social lines because, in Detroit's industrial trenches, everyone had a single mission: produce victory. Meanwhile, the Nazis couldn't comprehend it. Hitler's ministers laughed at the idea of Ford's assembly bombers. They believed precision required artisans, not mass production. But their arrogance was their undoing. While German factories were scattered, under constant bombing and shortages, Willow Run ran like clockwork, fed by endless steel, oil, and manpower. It was America's most powerful weapon, efficiency incarnate. Each B-24 rolling out of the line carried more than bombs, it carried symbolism. It said, "You can terrorize Europe, but you can't outbuild Detroit." By 1944, over 8,600 B-24s had been produced at Willow Run, enough to form entire fleets. Those bombers devastated Nazi supply lines, shattered industrial centers, and turned Germany's war machine into ruins. Willow Run didn't just change the course of World War II, it changed how wars would be fought forever. Because it proved a single truth: in the modern age, victory belongs not to the strongest army, but to the fastest producer. In a world obsessed with conquest, Willow Run showed that organization is power. Detroit had turned industry into a weapon, and Willow Run was the barrel of the gun. The battle for Europe was being fought thousands of miles away, but in Detroit, another kind of war raged. A war of endurance. Of labor. Of transformation. The city that once roared with the sounds of car engines now thundered with the hammering of machines, welding sparks, and roaring furnaces. But as millions of men left for the front lines, America faced a new problem: who would keep the factories alive? The answer came from an unexpected army, an army without rifles, without ranks, but with courage and purpose. The women of Detroit. They came in waves, dressed in overalls and bandanas, stepping into roles society had long denied them. Housewives became riveters. Secretaries became welders. Daughters of mechanics, seamstresses, teachers, and farmers learned to build bombers, tanks, and engines. This was the birth of a revolution inside the arsenal of democracy. The government called them Rosie the Riveters, a name that would become immortal, but behind the poster was reality, exhaustion, danger, and sacrifice. The work was brutal. Long hours under scorching lights, ears deafened by steel presses, hands blistered from metal and oil. But they didn't stop. Because every rivet, every bolt, every completed machine meant one thing: someone's son might come home alive. At Willow Run alone, 1/3 of the 42,000 workers were women. Many had never worked a machine in their lives, but within months, they were mastering tools with the precision of trained engineers. They were assembling the B-24 Liberator's fuselage, wings, and engines, with no room for error. They weren't just filling gaps, they were redefining what strength meant. It wasn't just women, either. Detroit's workforce became one of the most diverse in America's history. African American workers, long excluded from industrial jobs, were finally called upon, sometimes reluctantly, often resisted, but undeniably needed. They joined the lines, stood shoulder to shoulder with white workers, and proved that ability knew no color. The factories of Detroit became an unintentional social experiment, one that tore down old barriers out of necessity. The war had forced America to look beyond prejudice and see only productivity. Racism, sexism, inequality, they all collided with the urgent need to win. The line didn't care who you were. The only color that mattered was the silver of steel. These women, and the men who worked beside them, lived under the unrelenting tempo of war. 12-hour shifts, 6 or 7 days a week. Childcare centers sprang up near factories. Cafeterias ran around the clock. Entire neighborhoods were built just to house the influx of workers. Detroit became a city that never slept, a city lit by sparks instead of stars. For the first time, the industrial world had a feminine face. And it was fierce. When the war ended, generals would speak of tanks, planes, and strategies. But they often forgot the hands that built them, the quiet, tireless hands of women who transformed Detroit into a war engine. One worker later said, "We didn't think we were changing history. We were just doing what had to be done." Yet they did change history. They changed how nations viewed women, labor, and power itself. The women of Detroit didn't fight on the battlefield, but they forged its weapons. They didn't seek glory, but they carried victory in their palms. They were, in every sense, women of steel. And when the last bomber rolled out of Willow Run, it wasn't just a triumph of technology, it was a triumph of humanity. Because beneath the roar of the machines, the rhythm of hammers, and the smoke of the factories, there was the heartbeat of an entire generation, pounding in unison for one cause: freedom. By 1943, Hitler's empire had reached its limit. His armies were bleeding on the Eastern Front, his Luftwaffe was being outmatched in the skies, and his once invincible panzers were breaking down faster than they could be replaced. But what truly doomed Nazi Germany wasn't what was happening in Europe, it was what was happening in Detroit. Inside the industrial belly of America, the arsenal of democracy was reaching full power. This phrase, first spoken by Roosevelt, had evolved from an idea into an unstoppable machine. The factories of Detroit had become a vast network of precision, a living organism dedicated entirely to war production. And it was not just Detroit itself, its influence rippled outward, commanding an entire industrial ecosystem across America. Ford's Willow Run was producing bombers by the hour. Chrysler's tank arsenal was turning out Shermans faster than the Reich could build Tigers. General Motors was producing more trucks, engines, and artillery than the entire German army combined. America's factories weren't just making weapons, they were making time. Every minute saved in Detroit was a minute stolen from Hitler. For every bomber that rolled off a Michigan line, there was a convoy in the Atlantic, a beachhead in France, a strike over Berlin. The entire Allied war machine, from the deserts of North Africa to the snows of Stalingrad, ran on Detroit's power. Even Britain and the Soviet Union, though allies in blood, depended on the Motor City's veins of steel. Through the Lend-Lease program, American factories supplied them with trucks, tanks, and aircraft. Soviet offensives were fueled by American gasoline and driven on American tires. The Red Army's victory in the East was carried, in no small part, on Detroit's engines. Meanwhile, in Germany, Hitler's ministers scrambled. The Führer raged at his generals, demanding more tanks, more planes, more miracles. But his empire was cracking from within. Bombings crippled railways, resources ran dry, factories stood in ruins. Germany's production line was shattered. Detroit's was only growing stronger. By 1944, American industry produced twice as many war materials as all Axis powers combined. Detroit alone built 30% of the nation's total output. Every hour, 24 hours a day, something lethal was born, and each one carried a message carved into its steel. Freedom has factories. Tyranny has graves. But the true genius of Detroit was not just its scale, it was its system. The Americans didn't just build machines, they built logistics. Detroit's precision ensured that parts from one factory could fit another's assembly line perfectly. Trucks, tanks, and bombers shared interchangeable components, an innovation the Germans never mastered. In Hitler's war machine, complexity was a curse. Each tank model needed different parts, different tools, different training. Efficiency died under pride. In Detroit, pride served efficiency. The assembly line was king. And so, while Hitler's Reich staggered under the weight of its own contradictions, America surged ahead with terrifying unity. Steel mills roared in Pennsylvania. Rubber poured in from the south. Engines hummed in Michigan. It was as if an entire nation had transformed into one single, colossal factory. When Allied generals planned invasions, they did so knowing Detroit would keep them supplied. They could lose battles, but they could not lose momentum, because Detroit never stopped. The war was not just fought by soldiers or generals, it was fought by engineers, welders, and machinists who understood something deeper: production is strategy. And Hitler had lost that strategy the moment Detroit awoke. The arsenal of democracy was not built on ideology. It was built on machinery, mathematics, and manpower. And those three things, relentless, efficient, unbreakable, would soon bury the empire that believed itself eternal. By 1944, the world had begun to shift. The iron fist of Nazi domination, once feared and unstoppable, began to tremble, not because Hitler's armies had suddenly grown weak, but because the Allies had become something Hitler could never match, mechanized beyond imagination. Every victory on the battlefield from that year onward carried Detroit's fingerprint. Every tank that rolled through Europe, every bomber that darkened the German sky, every supply truck that thundered down muddy roads, they all came from the same place, the heart of American industry. Detroit's machines had become the silent army. When the Allies stormed the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944, the invasion wasn't just a military feat, it was a logistical miracle. Behind every soldier came the mechanical tide, fleets of amphibious trucks, armored vehicles, jeeps, and tanks, all born from Detroit's relentless production. The U.S. Army alone landed with over 50,000 vehicles in the first days of the invasion. Hitler's generals watched in disbelief as the horizon filled with machinery. Germany had expected soldiers. It was met with steel. The M4 Sherman tank, Detroit's most famous offspring, became the workhorse of liberation. It was fast, adaptable, and above all, mass-produced. The Nazis mocked it, calling it inferior to their heavy Tigers and Panthers, but they failed to grasp the brutal arithmetic of industrial war. For every Tiger tank the Germans built, Detroit built 10 Shermans. For every bomber Germany launched, America sent a dozen. Quantity had become its own form of quality. Hitler's strategy relied on intimidation, on shock, terror, and fear. America's answer was persistence, the slow, mechanical suffocation of the Reich. When Allied bombers filled the skies above Germany, many of them were B-24 liberators from Willow Run. Ford's airborne army. Those bombers, guided by Detroit-built engines, dropped destruction on Hitler's factories, railways, and refineries with mathematical precision. The Luftwaffe, once the pride of Germany, began to vanish. Its planes couldn't be replaced fast enough. Its pilots couldn't train fast enough. Its fuel couldn't last long enough. Detroit had become Hitler's invisible enemy, an enemy he couldn't bomb, couldn't intimidate, and couldn't outwork. On the ground, the story was no different. In North Africa, Patton's tanks, many rolling straight from Chrysler's arsenal, smashed through Rommel's defenses. In France, Sherman divisions thundered across the countryside, supported by trucks from Chevrolet and Dodge. Each vehicle, each gun, each engine represented one more piece of Detroit's iron determination. The German Wehrmacht, for all its discipline and skill, was now fighting a war against numbers. And no nation in history had ever produced numbers like America. Detroit's victory wasn't glamorous. It didn't wear medals or march in parades. It was quiet, methodical, and merciless. Its weapon was output. Its strategy was speed. Its soldiers were workers. By the winter of 1944, the once proud Reich was exhausted. Its railways lay in ruins. Its factories stood in silence. Its panzers ran out of fuel before they even reached the front lines. Meanwhile, Detroit was producing more war machines than ever, even as the end of the conflict came into sight. When Allied soldiers finally crossed the Rhine, they were not just carrying rifles, they were carrying the strength of an entire city that had turned itself into a weapon. Detroit had proven that in the modern world, war was no longer won by empires, but by industries. And as Hitler's Reich crumbled, the message was clear. Power no longer belonged to the loudest, but to the most efficient. Detroit had built more than machines. It had built momentum, and momentum, once unleashed, was unstoppable. By 1945, the once mighty Third Reich was a skeleton of steel and smoke. The empire that had promised 1,000 years of dominance was burning from within, eaten alive not only by invading armies but by an invisible enemy that had been grinding it down for years, Detroit's industry. Hitler had always believed that willpower could conquer the world. That belief had built his army, fueled his propaganda, and hypnotized a nation. But willpower alone cannot refuel tanks, rebuild bombed factories, or replace lost aircraft. Wars, in the end, are not won by speeches. They are won by production lines. While Hitler obsessed over symbols and ideology, America obsessed over systems and logistics. By 1944, Detroit's factories had produced more than 2.6 million military vehicles, 300,000 aircraft, and 86,000 tanks. Every one of them represented not just American innovation but German exhaustion. The Allied bombing campaigns, supported by fleets of B-24 Liberators born from Ford's Willow Run, shattered German industrial hubs. Cities like Essen, Hamburg, and Berlin, once symbols of power, were reduced to rubble. Yet even as Germany struggled to rebuild, Detroit kept expanding its output. It was an unequal war. For every German plane destroyed, the Luftwaffe could replace only one. For every American bomber lost, Detroit built 5 more. The math was merciless, and math, not ideology, would decide the end. By early 1945, Germany was running on fumes. Oil reserves were gone. Synthetic fuel plants were in ruins. Tanks sat immobile, not for lack of courage, but for lack of gasoline. Soldiers marched instead of driving. Horses returned to the battlefield. It was a medieval sight in a modern war, and it exposed the fatal flaw in Hitler's empire. His industry was too fragile, too centralized, too dependent on conquest. America, meanwhile, was just getting started. Its production lines ran without interruption. Its workers were fed, paid, and motivated. Its cities were untouched by bombs. While Europe starved, Detroit grew stronger with every month. Hitler had thought he could break the world's morale. Instead, the world broke his machinery. In the final months of the war, the Allies advanced with an overwhelming flood of Detroit's creations. Sherman tanks rolled through the Ardennes. Jeep convoys stretched for miles across liberated roads. B-24s and B-17s blackened the skies above Berlin. The Reich wasn't defeated in a single battle, it was dismantled, one factory, one rail line, one engine at a time. Even Hitler himself began to realize the truth. In the concrete tomb of his bunker, he ranted about America's machine culture, a society of workers and engineers rather than soldiers. He could not comprehend how such a system, soulless, as he called it, had outlasted his ideologically pure empire. He had underestimated the soul of machinery, the intelligence of organization. Detroit's strength wasn't born from nationalism or tyranny, it was born from function. Every piston, every gear, every worker on the line was part of something greater, a synchronized, mechanical civilization. And that civilization had just rewritten the laws of warfare. When the Reich finally fell in May 1945, its ruins told a story that Northwest Victory Parade could express. The swastika had been defeated not just by bombs, but by blueprints, not by slogans, but by systems. Hitler's empire was a creature of fire and fury. Detroit's was a creature of logic and production. And when the two collided, fire burned fast. Steel endured. The world had entered a new era, an era where wars would no longer be decided by kings or generals, but by industrial capacity. And in that new world, Detroit stood as the undisputed capital of power. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the cities of Europe lay in ruins. Berlin was a skeleton of shattered stone. Dresden, a graveyard of ash. From Warsaw to Cologne, the world Hitler had promised to rebuild in glory was now reduced to rubble and ghosts. But across the Atlantic, the air hummed with a different sound, the rhythm of engines, cranes, and machines. Detroit was still roaring. While the old world burned, the new world had become the workshop of history. The war had revealed a truth so vast it redefined geopolitics: the power to produce is the power to rule. Detroit had proven it. Its factories had not only armed America but fed the world. Trucks, tanks, bombers, engines, ships, millions of them poured from assembly lines with a precision and speed the planet had never witnessed. And when the war ended, that momentum did not fade. Detroit didn't stop. It shifted gears. The same machines that had built bombers were now building cars again. The same hands that had assembled tanks were now assembling a peacetime economy. The transformation was seamless, because Detroit had learned something Hitler never did: adaptability is the highest form of strength. Within a few short years, Detroit went from making the weapons that destroyed Germany to making the vehicles that rebuilt the world. The jeeps that carried soldiers now carried families. The trucks that supplied the front lines now carried food across nations. The factories that once roared for war now hummed for prosperity. This was the birth of the American century. An era where production, not conquest, became the new measure of power. The U.S. emerged from World War II not just victorious, but unscathed, its homeland untouched, its industries booming, its currency dominant. Detroit was the engine behind that dominance. While Europe struggled to rebuild, Detroit's output became the foundation of a global recovery. Under the Marshall Plan, American industry, led by Detroit, supplied Europe with machinery, vehicles, and tools. The very nation that had turned its factories into weapons now used them to rebuild civilization. It was more than generosity. It was strategy. Detroit had become America's greatest diplomat. Every shipment of trucks or tractors was also a shipment of influence. The road to global leadership was paved with Detroit steel. And yet, beneath the triumph, a quiet realization grew: something irreversible had changed in the world. Before 1939, empires had ruled through land and armies. After 1945, empires would rule through factories and economies. Detroit had turned capitalism into a weapon, and victory had made that weapon permanent. The war had shown that democracy, armed with machinery and discipline, could outproduce tyranny. That production, when guided by purpose, could be mightier than ideology. And that nations were no longer defeated by generals but by supply chains. In Hitler's bunker, the dream of domination had died. In Detroit's assembly lines, the dream of production was just beginning. The legacy of that transformation would echo for decades. The Cold War that followed wasn't just a military standoff, it was an industrial one. America's factories against the Soviet Union's. Consumerism against communism. Automation against command economy. And at the heart of America's confidence, still beating like a piston, was the memory of Detroit, the city that once outproduced an empire and changed the meaning of power itself. Detroit had proven that the ultimate weapon was not the bomb, nor the bullet, but the machine. Because machines never tire. Machines never bleed. And when driven by freedom and ingenuity, machines can remake the world. The city that built the bombers that broke Hitler's empire had built more than victory. It had built a system, one that would rule the second half of the 20th century. Detroit had not just won a war. It had defined modern power. The story of Detroit does not end in triumph, it ends in a lesson. Because history is cruel to its heroes. The same machine that built America's victory eventually began to consume the city that created it. In 1945, Detroit was the beating heart of the world's most powerful nation, rich, unstoppable, industrially divine. But empires, whether built on conquest or production, often fall for the same reason: they forget why they rose. Detroit's fall began not with a bomb, but with silence. As peace returned, the relentless demand for tanks and bombers vanished overnight. The arsenal of democracy, once unstoppable, had to reinvent itself again, but this time, the enemy was not across an ocean. It was within. Automation replaced the hands that had once built victory. Corporations chased cheaper labor overseas. The global system that Detroit helped create, a system of efficiency, production, and profit, eventually turned on its creator. By the 1970s, the hum of the factories had grown faint. The city that had symbolized the triumph of democracy through production began to rust. Neighborhoods emptied. Machines went still. Detroit, the city that outproduced Hitler's empire, became a ghost of its own greatness. But history does not mourn, it teaches. Detroit's story is not just a tragedy of economics. It is a warning written in steel and smoke. Power, no matter how great, must evolve. When a system stops innovating, when it forgets its purpose, it begins to decay. Hitler's empire fell because it relied on ideology instead of production. Detroit faltered because it relied on production instead of adaptation. And yet, even in its decline, the city's legacy endures. Every factory in China, every production line in Japan, every logistics network in the world traces its roots to Detroit's blueprints. The concept of mass production as national power, that was born here. The ghost of Detroit lives in every machine that moves, every factory that runs, every nation that rises through industry. Because what Detroit proved, and what the world must never forget, is that true strength lies not in destruction, but in creation. That the hammer is mightier than the sword. That efficiency, unity, and purpose can defeat any tyrant, no matter how terrifying his armies may seem. Detroit's story is both prophecy and warning. Build with discipline, or fall by your own design. In the ashes of war, Detroit once forged the blueprint for power, a power built on rhythm, precision, and relentless will. Its rise and fall mirror the story of every empire, creation, dominance, and decline. But even in its ruins, Detroit remains immortal, because it proved that machines can serve freedom, not just tyranny. The city that forged victory against Hitler gave humanity its greatest truth, that progress is the sharpest weapon of all. So when you see an engine roar, when a factory hums, when a skyline glows, remember the city that made it possible. Remember Detroit. The city that built victory, and then became its own warning. Detroit didn't just outproduce Hitler's empire, it outproduced history itself. And if this story moved you, if you believe that power still belongs to those who build, then hit that subscribe button. Because this channel isn't just about history, it's about understanding the machinery of power.